Welcome. So this lecture is meant to accompany your reading of Meeting the Predator from Eye of the Crocodile by Val Plumwood. So in the two Val Plumwood pieces that you're reading for this week, you're going to find two very different styles of writing from the same philosopher. So Val Plumwood was a logician. She studied logic and wrote on logic. That was her training, and the early part of her career was dedicated to that. And that was prior to her becoming one of the leading figures in ecofeminist philosophy. And so her writing often follows a very clear structure and order. And that's certainly the case with the reading from Environmental Culture that you're reading for this week. And that piece is going to be much more dense than the Meeting the Predator piece that you're reading. And so, yeah, in this piece, the Meeting the Predator, this was written later in her life, and it was published after her death. And it follows a much more sort of narrative storytelling style than you'll find in the chapter from Environmental Culture. So this is a recounting of her near-death experience when she was attacked by a saltwater crocodile, and the way in which this sort of lived, embodied experience radically changed her perception of the world, of philosophy, and of other species, other animals, and nature. And so above all else, I just want you to be clear that this is an exploration of human nature dualism through a recounting of her actual experience with this animal. And so think through this piece and keep it in mind when you're reading the chapter from Environmental Culture, because I think this will really help in your interpretation of that more traditional style of philosophical writing. Okay, so as Plumwood writes early in this chapter, she says, "My saurian teacher was a wrestling master and a far better judge than I of my incautious character, the precarious nature of human life, and of various other things I needed to know and have striven to pass on to others." So in a very real way, Plumwood is proposing that if we are perceptive and attuned to it, there are always lessons to be learned from the more than human world, from nature, from the environment, albeit often it takes something monumental, such as this attack by this crocodile, to sort of like awaken that lesson. And so one central lesson that she puts forward in this piece is an awareness of our place within a wider ecosystem, within wider connections. So humans often like to pretend that we are, apex predators, or we are removed from embodied vulnerability with other animals. So really one part of this piece is trying to get you to think about yourself as edible, right? And so like really every other plant and animal out there. And so as she writes on page 10, it is not a minor or inessential feature of our human existence that we are food, juicy, nourishing bodies. Yet, as I looked into the eye of the crocodile, I realized that my planning for this journey upriver had given insufficient attention to this important aspect of human life, to my own vulnerability as an edible animal being. So continuing on, she writes that, quote, "Of course, in some very remote and abstract way, I knew it happened, knew that humans were animals, and were sometimes, very rarely, eaten like other animals. I knew I was food for crocodiles, that my body, like theirs, was made of meat. But then again, in some very important way, I did not know it, absolutely rejected it. Somehow, the fact of being food for others had not seemed real, not in the way it did now, as I stood in my canoe in the beating rain, staring down into the beautiful gold-freckled eyes of the crocodile. Until that moment, I knew that I was food in some remote, abstract way, that I knew I was an animal, was mortal. In the moment of truth, though, abstract knowledge becomes concrete." So what is Plumwood doing here? So in many ways, she is taking some of the more philosophically developed ideas you will read about in the chapter from environmental culture, particularly, which is focused on dualisms between humans and nature, various like functions of dualism. And she's showing that there is a sense in which, even if we have thought through these ideas, it takes a kind of physical embodied experience to really put them into perspective. So there's this, difference between knowing and really knowing. So like knowing in sort of the abstract and knowing in the concrete. So think about this for a bit. Have you had an experience where you found yourself in this kind of vulnerability? Or have you thought about yourself as edible before? Perhaps when hiking in a remote, part of the wilderness, right? So Plumwood's discussion in this piece reminded me a bit of times when I've hiked in remote areas. So I've hiked part of the Pacific Crest Trail, and I distinctly remember passing through a section of Mount Hood National Forest between Timberline Lodge and Cascade Locks. Perhaps some of you have hiked this trail as well. And so myself and the other person I was hiking with were putting in some long days, and we were hiking into the dark at night, and with just like headlamps. And this is an area where there've been attacks by mountain lions in the past, and this was definitely on my mind throughout this experience, throughout hiking this. And I think this raises an interesting question. Why is it that we oftentimes want to experience being out in vast, wild, untouched wilderness areas, but often resent when we're actually presented with the real and present danger that exists in such places? So there are numerous examples of when animals attack humans, such as cougars in this part of the Mount Hood forest that I just mentioned, or grizzly bears in Yellowstone, or shark attacks in the ocean, right? Often people's responses are to go out and kill the animal that attacked, and this is often based on scientifically unfounded claims that the animal has a thirst for human blood now, and they'll attack again. Or perhaps this is actually maybe rooted in a kind of feeling of revenge, right? So think about these cases and ask yourself, were you in a position like Plumwood, who was like, consider if you were in this kind of situation where you were, nearly killed by a crocodile. Could you look at this animal that did this as a teacher to you, rather than an enemy, rather than someone who should be killed for what they did to you? Just think about this. So as Plumwood continues to show throughout this piece, this experience led her to realize that the way she saw the world, philosophically, ethically, politically, and so forth, was really radically divergent from the world as it was when actually thrown into an experience such as this with the crocodile, right? So she shows that perhaps one central accepted view of the world resulting from a kind of ethical anthropocentrism and human superiority is that predation is what we do to others. Okay, it's what humans do to others. It's what we do to those who are viewed as inferior. And this, as she claims, is rooted in dualisms between, it's a kind of dualism between humans and nature, but it's also, on her account, a sort of dualism between mind and body, right? Where we also deny our animal nature, our animality. And so she mentions this as well. This thought is that this view is also a kind of denial of our shared capacities with other animals, even beyond this kind of edibility that she mentions. And this, of course, operates in both ways, right? Humans often see themselves as mere minds. We are also often going to deny the minds and consciousness of other animals, right? And she sees this as being integrally tied to this like denial of animality. So as she continues writing on page 13, quote, "For a modern human being from the first or overprivileged world, the humbling experience of becoming food for another animal is now utterly foreign, almost unthinkable. And our dominant story, which holds that humans are different from and higher than other creatures, are made out of mind stuff, has encouraged us to eliminate from our lives any animals that are disagreeable, inconvenient, or dangerous to humans. This means especially animals that can prey on humans. In the absence of a more rounded form of the predation experience, we come to see predation as something we do to others, the inferior ones, but which is never done to us. We are victors and never victims, experiencing triumph but never tragedy. Our true identity as minds, not as bodies. Thereby, we intensify and reinforce illusions of superiority and apartness. Since the potential for more corrective and chastening forms of experience has been eliminated from normal life, there is less and less experience available of the type that can correct this illusion. So she goes on to illustrate how this experience disrupted her typical perception of ethics as well, right? So this is in relation to what she calls the quote normal universe, or the individual justice universe. So on page 13, she continues. She writes, quote, "I leapt through the eye of the crocodile into what seemed also a parallel universe, one with completely different rules to the normal universe. This harsh, unfamiliar territory was the Heraclitean universe, where everything flows, where we live the other's death, die the other's life, the universe represented in the food chain. I was suddenly transformed in the parallel universe into the form of a small, edible animal, whose death was of no more significance than that of a mouse. And as I saw myself as meat, I also saw with an incredible shock that I inhabited a grim, relentless, and deplorable world that would make no exceptions for me, no matter how smart I was, because like all living things, I was made of meat, was nutritious food for another being." So this, I think, is also an important idea to keep in mind for when we get to week 7 and discussions around ethical issues related to conservation. So there will be some questions around, for example, wild animal suffering, and to what degree should humans have the obligation to step in and assist animals in such situations. Um, so in uh, one second. Right, sorry about that. I had some sirens going by here. Yeah, so what I was saying was that in this quote I just mentioned, and this idea of this kind of like individual justice world versus the kind of like Heraclitean world, the sort of world that's populated by the rules of nature, right, or sort of like the indifference to individual justice, right? This will be a really interesting point to come back to in week 7, because we'll be discussing ethical issues related to conservation. And so we'll definitely be talking a little bit about wild animal suffering, and sort of, to what degree should humans have the obligation to step in and assist animals in these kind of situations. So, in this individual justice world, humans are seen as Plumwood accounts, right? Humans are seen as, fighting to preserve our bodies or the bodies of others. And, our empathy may push us to alleviate the other's suffering. But as Plumwood shows, a lot of, our misery, and certainly the misery and suffering of other animals within ecosystems, within nature, it can't be really accounted for rationally in an individual justice universe where we perceive to have a kind of ownership over a combination of matter that temporarily constitutes individual bodies. So there's this kind of feeling of hopelessness that arises from being caught between this individual justice universe and the Heraclitean universe. Whereas, as Plumwood rightfully shows, death and suffering are kind of integral parts of ecological processes, right? And so there's a sense where they can't really reconcile each other, yet we exist within both of these universes, right? And so there's a kind of like the question is like, how do we navigate these kind of contradictions? So again, yeah, we'll definitely be returning to this discussion later in the term. So going back to this question again, I want you to think about what it means to be food, right? This is central to this chapter from Plumwood. Have you ever seen yourself in the way that Plumwood expresses? What are some of your reactions to the common human practices that she discusses, in terms of denying death, denying edibility, denying animality, or denying our embodiment? And beyond the philosophical and ethical components of this piece, what of the political claims? Because she's claiming that this denial of embodiment of animality also has, a strong impact on our relationships with other humans, and certainly on the broader environment. So she writes on page 18, quote, modernist liberal individualism teaches us that we own our lives and bodies. Politically, as an enterprise, we are running, and experientially, as a drama, we are variously narrating, writing, acting, and or reading. As hyper individuals, we owe nothing to anybody, not to our mothers, let alone to any nebulous Earth community. Exceptionalized as both species and individuals, we humans cannot be positioned in the food chain in the same way as other animals. Predation on humans is monstrous, exceptionalized, and subject to extreme retaliation. The Western problematic of death, where the essential self is disembodied spirit, poses a false choice of continuity, even eternity, in the realm of the spirit, versus the reductive materialist concept of death as the complete ending of the story of the material embodied self. Both horns of this dilemma exact a terrible price: alienation from the earth in the first case, and loss of meaning and narrative continuity for the self in the second. So think about this a bit more as you're reading through this piece and digesting what she's writing. So do you think we eliminate the disagreeable, the inconvenient, dangerous, the separateness and apartness from our life? Do you think this is the case as she's putting forward in this piece? And what does it mean to understand nature or a world that would make no exception for us, right? That would not see humans as special among others, right? What would it mean to be more conscious of our animality, to reflect on our kinship with others rather than a kind of dualism or hierarchy? And do you think there's something to reclaim that nature and animals are seen as mindless and often excluded from ethics and culture, right? This will be definitely central to our discussion next week in week 4 of animal ethics, right? So what does it mean that all of us are on her account, all of us as in both humans and other animals, plants, and so forth? What does it mean that all of us are both food and more than food? Right? And have you ever thought about what your usefulness is to other beings and organisms rather than what their usefulness is to you? So a deep claim in this chapter is that each of us are, in a sense, made for others. So through this, we might find a sense of solidarity that can transcend our species, but instead, as she claims, humans often attempt to resist this. So consider again the practices of denying death, right? The coffin, which she uses as an example of resisting, for example. We position on her account, we're positioning ourselves above, beyond, or outside of the food web as beings who can manipulate it and so forth. And in doing so, she wants to say we lose a sense of our connection within that food web. Okay. So yeah, with that, I'm going to conclude this discussion of Meeting the Predator, and I'm really looking forward to reading your responses on this piece for this week.